Imagine a place where the walls are not just stone and steel, but a living, breathing logic. A fortress engineered with one cold, perfect purpose: to make the very idea of escape unthinkable. This is Black Dolphin Prison in Russia, a place so feared it earned the name the Living Coffin. Its control room is the beating heart of this system, monitored by 242 unblinking eyes, one security camera for every 2 inmates. No shadow moves unseen. For decades, it was hailed as the ultimate victory of security over chaos, a flawless machine for containing the most dangerous minds in the nation. But what if the system's greatest strength became its most profound failure? What if, in building a perfect cage for the body, they inadvertently created a hell for the human spirit inside? Today, we conduct a forensic investigation into this monument of control. We'll trace its evolution from an 18th century fortress to a modern panopticon, and uncover the chilling psychological truth that emerged from its silent, well-lit corridors. If you're ready to look inside a place designed to be forgotten, watch on. The wind out on the steppe has a sound like nothing else. It doesn't whistle through trees. There are none. It doesn't rush over water. The rivers are sluggish and far between. It just comes across 1,000 miles of flat, unforgiving earth, a constant low moan that predates empires. It was this wind that heard the first sounds of construction in 1773. The decree had come from St. Petersburg, from the hand of Catherine the Great, Empress of all the Russias. The southern frontier was wild, vulnerable to raids from nomadic tribes. She needed a statement, carved in stone. And so at the confluence of the Ural and Sakhmara rivers, near the settlement of Orenburg, they began to build. Not a prison, not yet, a fortress. Its walls were thick, its bastions angular and projecting, designed according to the latest military science. The goal was simple: to keep threats out, to be a fixed point of imperial power in a formless landscape. They chose the location for its strategic value, yes, but also for its isolation. The climate was a weapon, bitterly cold in winter, scorching in summer. The emptiness was a moat. The fortress rose, a grey geometric intrusion on the tan expanse of the steppe. It was a shell, and for a while it served its purpose. But empires are restless things. They expand, they contract, they turn inward, and the tools they build for one purpose often find a darker, more permanent use. The first turn of the key was almost silent. It happened in the wake of a different sound, the failed ring of steel on Senate Square in St. Petersburg in 1825. The Decembrists, noble officers dreaming of constitutions, had been crushed, but their dream and their punishment would echo. The Tsarist regime, shaken, began to look for places to put ideas it considered dangerous, remote places. The Orenburg fortress, already a symbol of control on the frontier, was a natural choice. The barracks that once housed soldiers were slowly emptied. The rooms, with their thick stone walls and small high windows, took on a new function. Political dissidents, intellectuals, writers, men whose crime was thought, began to arrive under guard. The architecture didn't change, but its orientation did. The guard towers, built to scan the horizon for approaching horsemen, now turned their gaze inward toward the courtyards. The massive gates, designed to repel cannon fire, now served to lock men in. The system's first crude rule was established: isolation from the center. Remove the infected element from the body politic. Deposit it here in this geographic silence. The wind still blew, but now it carried the whispers of poets and revolutionaries, muffled by stone. The fortress had discovered its latent talent. It was no longer a shield, it was a lockbox, and the key was being turned. History has a way of repeating itself with a different uniform. In 1917, the world turned red. The Bolsheviks, seizing power, inherited an empire in collapse and all its tools of control. The civil war that followed was a furnace of brutality. The Orenburg fortress was seized by the Red Army. It was no longer a Tsarist relic, it was state property. And the new state had a vast hungry system for processing human beings, the Gulag. The fortress was formally integrated, given a bureaucratic title, Corrective Labor Colony Number 2. The name was a manifesto. Corrective Labor. The Tsarist model of passive exile was over. The Soviet system was active, industrial. Punishment had to be productive. The prisoner was to be reforged through work. The stone walls now enclosed a new logic. Inmates were marched out to nearby quarries or to workshops within the walls. Their bodies became a source of value, however meager. The system added a component: economic extraction. The goal was no longer just removal, but transformation, or at least the appearance of it. The fortress, built to keep nomads out, then used to keep thinkers in, was now a factory. Its product was ideological conformity. Its raw material was human will. It had survived revolution by adapting. But the greatest test of its capacity was yet to come. A storm was gathering in Moscow in the mind of one man, and it would fill this shell to bursting. They came in waves, on crowded trains, in black vans. The late 1930s, the Great Purge. Stalin's paranoia became a state engine, and it needed a place to deposit its exhaust. Officers of the Red Army who had survived the Civil War now found themselves accused of treason. Party officials, artists, engineers, ordinary citizens, caught in a neighbor's whispered lie. The label was simple, final: enemy of the people. And Corrective Labor Colony Number 2 received them. The system strained under the numbers. The orderly logic of labor broke down. Overcrowding was the new protocol. The thin soup and black bread became thinner. The real work was not in the quarries anymore. It was in the administration block. Record-keeping became the paramount function. Names, dates, arrest codes, sentence summaries. The colony began to operate less like a factory and more like a grim, meticulous archive. It was cataloguing human beings, storing them on shelves of stone and iron. Survival was no longer a question of rehabilitation. It was a brutal arithmetic of calories and arbitrary violence. Executions were carried out not just by formal sentence, but by neglect, by disease, by a guard's casual cruelty. The fortress had become a library of the condemned. Its purpose was containment and erasure. Then, in 1953, the architect of the terror died. The gears of the purges ground to a halt. The vast Gulag system, of which this colony was one small hardened node, began to slowly unravel. A question hung in the cold air. In an era of supposed thaw, what was the purpose of a place like this? The answer, when it came, was not one of liberalization. It was a refinement, a colder, cleaner, more scientific vision. The new penology emerged from the offices of theorists in Moscow in the late 1950s and through the 1960s. The rhetoric of re-education and reforging was still used for the masses. But for a certain category of man, a different concept took shape. Rehabilitation was deemed impossible. These were not misguided comrades. They were societal toxins, permanent, dangerous, and irredeemable. The goal shifted from transformation to permanent neutralization. It was a thermodynamic approach to human beings. Create a closed system from which no dangerous energy could escape. The planners looked across the network of Soviet prisons. Their eyes settled on the old Orenburg fortress. Its location was perfect, remote, symbolically charged. Its history was a resume of confinement. It was selected for a radical, purpose-built upgrade. The blueprints that were drawn were not for a labor colony. They were for a vault, a human archive of a different kind. The target population was explicitly defined: osobo opasni recidivisti, especially dangerous recidivists. Serial murderers, cannibals, traitors, terrorists, men who had, in the state's view, forfeited their very humanity. The design goal was stated with chilling clarity: absolute isolation, not a punishment to fit the crime, but a system to nullify the criminal. Escape was to be made a mathematical impossibility, a thought so futile it would die before it was fully formed. The fortress, born of Catherine's imperial ambition, hardened by the Tsars, tempered by the Gulag, was now to be perfected. It would become a machine for the production of silence. The construction crews arrived in the late 1960s. They did not tear the old walls down. They encased them. They reinforced them from within. The Tsarist stone became a core, around which a new, more precise shell was built. This was not a renovation, it was a metamorphosis. Budgets were allocated not for lathes or looms, but for reinforced concrete, for rolled steel, for thick, sound-absorbent materials, for miles of electrical cable. The architects designed a labyrinth within a fortress. Multiple sequential gates, each operated from a separate control point, ensuring no two would ever be open at the same time. Cell doors were specified as solid metal, with a narrow horizontal slot for food trays like the mouth of a postbox. Windows were to be sealed shut, frosted to admit a diffuse, sourceless light, but no view of the outside world. Not a sky, not a bird, not a blade of grass. And at the heart of the new design, a room. A silent, climate-controlled room. On its blueprints, a specific number was noted, a figure that would become the central nervous system of the entire organism, 242. The exact number of surveillance camera points. One camera for every 2 inmates. A panopticon, not of Bentham's imagination, but of Soviet engineering. Total, unblinking, optical control. The last brick was laid. The last camera was mounted. The system was a closed circuit now, waiting for power. It was a vault, engineered to hold the most volatile elements. All it needed was its first deposit. The experiment in absolute control was ready to begin. The first men arrived in the early 1970s, not with a bang, but with a whisper of bureaucratic efficiency. They were transferred from other prisons under heavy guard, their files stamped with the new ominous classification. The freshly designated FKU IK6 Orenburg, Penal Colony No. 6, awaited them. The nickname Black Dolphin would come later, a piece of grim folklore, but the essence was already present. The intake procedure was the first lesson in the new theology. Stripped, searched, examined under cold lights by a disinterested medic, they were reduced to biological matter. Their personal clothing, the last thread connecting them to a world of choices, was taken. In its place they received the uniform, coarse, dark fabric, identical in every stitch. A number was assigned. From that moment the man was secondary. The number was the primary fact. His history, his crimes, the twisted narrative of his life were compressed into a dossier stored in a locked cabinet in the warden's office. He was no longer a story. He was a case. Then came the first movement, and with it, the establishment of the system's most iconic and degrading ritual, a guard on either side, hands cuffed tightly behind the back, and then a firm, unyielding pressure on the back of the neck, forcing the head down, the spine into a permanent, submissive curve. This was the walk of shame, the pokodka. It was not merely a security measure to prevent sudden lunges. It was a physiological reprogramming. The inmate's world was reduced to a moving patch of floor, worn linoleum, concrete, the occasional seam, and the boots of the guards flanking him. He could not see ahead, could not make eye contact with others, could not see the architecture of his cage. He could only see his place in it, beneath notice, beneath dignity, in a state of perpetual apology for his own existence. This was the first rule of motion in the new system. You will move through this world as a question mark, a folded creature, your horizon limited to your own feet. The heavy gates sighed open on hydraulic pistons, then sealed shut behind them with a final resonant clunk. The sound was the punctuation mark on their old lives. The experiment was now live. The vault was sealed. A day inside the machine began not with a bell, but with the metallic scrape of the food slot opening. 6 a.m. A plastic tray slid through the opening, the slot snapping shut before the inmate's hand could even touch it. The cell was a study in sterile containment, 4.5 square meters shared by 2 men. Every surface was hard, cold, and immovable. The beds were concrete slabs, thinly padded. The table and stool were bolted to the floor. The toilet was a porcelain basin with no lid, positioned in full view of one's cellmate, and via the camera in the ceiling, the control room. There was no privacy, not even for basic functions. The window was a mockery of the concept, a pane of thick frosted glass set high in the wall, admitting a grey, directionless light but no image. Was it morning? Was it noon? The light gave no answer. It was simply on. part of the cell's permanent fittings day and night. The 24-hour illumination was a psychological weapon, banishing darkness, banishing the natural rhythm of sleep and wakefulness, making time a flat, uninterrupted plane. After the meal, the silence. There was no work detail, no communal activity. The men sat on their stools or lay on their slabs. They might have a book from the severely restricted library, a state-approved technical manual, a volume of Soviet-era poetry stripped of subtext. Talking was permitted, but in hushed tones, and the microphones in the cells could pick up a whisper. Conversations were stilted, circular, poisoned by the knowledge of being monitored. What was there to talk about? The past was a minefield. The future did not exist. The present was this room. So they spoke of food, of vague aches and pains, of memories so generic they were meaningless. Mostly they sat in silence, listening to the hum of the lights and the distant, muffled sounds of the prison's machinery, the clang of a distant gate, the faint echo of boots on a walkway. The only break in the cellular stasis was the daily walk. For 30 minutes, if behavior was deemed satisfactory, an inmate would be taken in the bent-over pochodka through the labyrinth of gates to a small, open-air cage. These were not yards, but concrete pits topped with heavy wire mesh, like enclosures for dangerous birds. High walls prevented any view but a square of sky. Here the inmate was uncuffed and allowed to stand upright, to pace the 10-foot length of the cage, to feel the air, however stale, on his face. It was a taste of verticality, of unconstrained movement, and it was agonizingly brief. Guards watched from a catwalk above. Then, the signal. Hands behind the back. The stoop resumed. The walk back to the cell began. The return was always worse than the departure. The cell, which had become a universe of boredom, now felt like a coffin after that fleeting gasp of space. The evenings were a mirror of the mornings. Another tray through the slot. More hours of sitting or lying in the eternal electric twilight. Lights out was a misnomer. The main overhead might be dimmed, but a secondary bulb remained glowing. Sleep was fitful, haunted, a surrender to a vulnerability the environment was designed to exacerbate. The two men in the cell were not companions. They were accidental witnesses to each other's unraveling. They heard each other's nightmares, each other's muttered prayers or curses. They smelled each other's fear. The system had calculated the space needed for two human bodies to exist without physical conflict, but it had made no provision for the psychic contamination that occurred in such relentless, intimate proximity. The cell was a sealed terrarium, and within it two minds slowly decomposed, feeding off each other's despair. The flawless operation of this human archive depended on a logistics of silence, a ballet of controlled movements designed to eliminate chance. The core principle was the airlock or SAS system. No prisoner ever moved through a single door. Every corridor was a series of sequential gates, each controlled from a separate station. Gate A would open. The prisoner and his two guards would enter the interstitial space. Gate A would seal with a hydraulic hiss. Only then would Gate B be authorized to open. It was a system inspired by submarine or spaceship design, treating the prison not as a building, but as a series of pressurized compartments. The threat of a mass breakout, of inmates overwhelming a single point, was rendered geometrically impossible. Feeding the machine was a similarly sterile operation. The kitchen was a separate, secure block. Meals were pre-packaged in portion-controlled trays, a bland, calorically sufficient gruel of kasha, a piece of fish, boiled vegetables. Nutrition was a maintenance requirement, like lubricating a gear. The trays were loaded onto carts, wheeled to the cell blocks, and inserted through the slots by trustees, inmates with slightly more privilege, who worked under the direct, armed supervision of guards. No utensil was provided that could be fashioned into a tool. Spoons were soft, bendable plastic. The act of eating was reduced to a biological function, stripped of any social or pleasurable context. The financial logic of the place was a closed loop. The cost per inmate per year was a figure known to the accountants in Moscow, and it was many times higher than that of a standard corrective colony. Every ruble was allocated to the infrastructure of control: the salaries of the large guard contingent, the maintenance of the 242 camera system, the electricity for the perpetual lights, the replacement of reinforced steel and bulletproof glass. There was no budget line for rehabilitation programs, for education, for psychological counseling. Those were expenses for systems that believed in change. This system believed only in stasis. Its product was containment, and by its own metric, it was supremely cost-effective. An escape would represent a catastrophic systems failure, a loss of the asset and the total invalidation of the security investment. Therefore, the entire financial and operational model was geared towards making that cost-benefit analysis hold. Spend any amount to prevent the infinite cost of a breach. At the heart of this organism, in a soundproofed, climate-controlled room separate from the cell blocks, was its brain, the central control room. It hummed with a low electronic vitality. Banks of monitors, arranged in grids, displayed the feeds from all 242 cameras. The images were black and white, sharp and devoid of emotion. A guard could watch a man sitting on his stool for hours, a static figure in a static frame. Another screen might show a corridor, empty save for the occasional bent-over figure shuffling between gates. The guards here were not the ones applying the pressure to the neck. They were the eyes. Their training was specific. Observe patterns. Note deviations. Is inmate 743 sitting in his usual spot? Has inmate 112's pacing in his cell increased in frequency? The goal was to predict behavior through surveillance, to spot the nascent signs of rebellion or breakdown before they manifested in action. The psychological shift required of these control room operators was profound. They were not to engage with the inmates as human beings. The men on the screens were data points, objects moving through a security matrix. A flicker of anger on a face was not a human emotion. It was a potential threat indicator to be logged. A slumped posture was not despair. It was a deviation from the baseline posture. This dissociation was a necessary part of the system's efficiency. Empathy was a vulnerability, a point where the perfect logic of the machine could be compromised by the messy reality of human feeling. The guards in the control room were the high priests of a new faith, watching over their silent congregation, believing that total vision equated to total understanding. They could see every corner of every cell. What they could not see, what the cameras were utterly blind to, was the landscape within the skulls of the men they watched. They monitored the prison, but they had no window into the internal exile that was now beginning. The 1980s represented the Soviet-era peak of the Black Dolphin's operational efficiency. It had become the final repository for the USSR's most monstrous human artifacts. Serial killers, whose sprees had terrorized regions, were transferred here after their trials, their notoriety making them unacceptable risks for the general prison population. Cannibals, like the infamous Moscow vampire or the Kirov man-eater, found their way to these cells. Traitors and spies convicted of high treason, their knowledge too dangerous to allow any contact. Terrorists from nationalist movements. The inmate profile was a gallery of ultimate transgression. The prison's reputation was carefully cultivated, a dark legend used as a tool of deterrence. The message to the criminal world and to political dissidents was clear. There exists a tier of punishment beyond the brutal norm of the Gulag, a place where you cease to be a problem and become a specimen. The system's key performance indicator was a pristine round number, 0. 0 successful escapes, 0 breaches of the perimeter. This statistic was the foundation of its legitimacy, the proof of concept for the absolute isolation regime. Every procedure, every expense, every humiliation was justified by this unassailable figure. The men within might as well have been on another planet. The physical problem of escape had been solved. The fortress, now a high-tech vault, had achieved what Catherine's engineers, the Tsarist wardens and the Gulag administrators could only dream of: perfect, passive containment. It was a triumph of engineering over human will. In the 1990s, after the Soviet Union dissolved into history, the men who had designed and run the system looked back with a cold pride. Retired guards, interviewed in their small apartments in Orenburg, spoke not of cruelty, but of protocol. They described the drills, the relentless rehearsals for scenarios that never happened, a hostage-taking, a mass disturbance, a tunnel. They spoke of the system as one might speak of a powerful, complex machine they had once operated. "It was clockwork," one said, tapping his temple. "You followed the instructions. The instructions covered everything." Architects, now old men, pored over their blueprints with the affection of creators. They pointed to the redundancy of the gate systems, the precision of the camera sightlines, the quality of the soundproofing. They saw a puzzle they had solved. They acknowledged only one category of procedural failure: the suicide. It was handled with a brisk, bureaucratic detachment. The body would be discovered during a tray retrieval or a cell check. The control room would be notified. A specific somber protocol would activate. The cell would be sealed. A medical team and a senior officer would arrive. The body would be removed, the cell sanitized. Paperwork would be filled out, a death certificate attributing the cause to sudden death or acute psychosomatic crisis. The inmate's file would be pulled from the cabinet, stamped deceased and archived. The cell would be assigned a new number, and within days a new inmate would be placed inside. The incident was not seen as an indictment of the environment. It was a logistical event, a malfunction of a component. The machine itself was not at fault. The component had been flawed. This was the illusion of perfection, and it was seductive. The system had been designed to answer a single simple question: can we prevent them from getting out? The answer, demonstrably, was yes. The designers and operators took that yes and extrapolated it to mean they had solved the entire equation of punishment. They believed the silence of the prison was a sign of its success. The absence of riots, of escapes, of loud protests was read as the absence of problem. They did not yet understand that the chaos had not been eliminated. It had been internalized, displaced from the physical realm to the psychological. The machine was running smoothly, its gears well-oiled, its sensors active. But it was measuring the wrong things. It counted movements. It logged gate sequences. It ensured caloric intake. It had no metric for the slow dissolution of a mind, no alarm for the point at which a man's internal world collapses in upon itself. The cracks were not yet in the walls. They were forming in the silent, unseen spaces between thought and perception, in the sealed chambers of memory and hope. The system was watching the shell. It was blind to the slow-motion explosion happening within. The first cracks were not dramatic. They did not appear as shattered glass or bent bars. They manifested in the medical logbooks, in the quiet clinical notes of the prison doctor. In the early 2000s, a pattern began to emerge, a constellation of symptoms that defied easy diagnosis. Inmates were reporting persistent auditory hallucinations, voices that were not memories, but seemed to speak from the corners of their cells. Others complained of visual phenomena, shadows that coalesced into human shapes, patterns on the wall that writhed and swam. The official diagnosis was often schizoaffective disorder or acute paranoid psychosis, pre-existing conditions exacerbated by confinement. But the prison doctor, a weary man named Andrei Vasilievich, began to notice a correlation. The men most afflicted were not necessarily those with prior psychiatric histories. They were the long-termers, the ones who had been inside the dolphin's shell for a decade or more. Their files showed a gradual then rapid escalation in symptom severity. He coined an informal term for it in his notes: Syndrome Chernowa Delphina, Black Dolphin Syndrome. The symptoms were a textbook of sensory deprivation pathology, but rendered in the unique palette of the dolphin. There was the paranoia, of course, the belief that the guards were poisoning the food, that the cellmate was a planted informant, that the camera's red light was a laser aimed to slowly burn through their skull. But there were more disturbing manifestations. Men developed somatic delusions, convinced that their internal organs were rotting, that their bones were turning to glass, that insects were crawling beneath their skin. Some stopped eating, claiming the food was alive. Others engaged in compulsive, ritualistic behaviors, tapping the wall in precise sequences, arranging crumbs on their tray in elaborate patterns, performing hours of silent, repetitive calisthenics. The prison infirmary's stock of powerful antipsychotics, haloperidol clozapine, began to dwindle. Vasilievich would prescribe them, and for a time the hallucinations would recede, the paranoia would dull into a groggy acceptance. But it was a chemical dam against a rising tide. The underlying environment, the cause of the pressure, remained unchanged. The medication treated the symptom to preserve the system. It turned down the volume on the screaming mind so the silence of the prison could be maintained. The first real testimonies from inside the void were not spoken aloud. They were written in secret on scraps of paper, smuggled out during rare visits from human rights monitors, or through a trustee with a shred of conscience. These fragments, heavily redacted and anonymized, were like messages from a shipwreck, sealed in bottles and tossed into a sea of bureaucracy. They did not speak of physical abuse. The system was too precise for overt brutality. They spoke of a different kind of violence. "Time is not a river here," one inmate wrote, the handwriting shaky and childlike. "It is a wall, a thick, soft wall you press against every day, and it gives a little, but it never breaks. You push for a year, and you have moved an inch. You look back, and you cannot see where you started. You look ahead, and you see only more wall." Another described the loss of chronology. "I asked the guard what year it was. He told me. I did not believe him. I calculated in my head. According to my count, it should have been 1998. It was 2007. 9 years. Gone. Not spent. Just missing. Where did they go? Did I sleep through them? Or did I live them and they left no mark?" The sealed window became a torment. The light changes. Sometimes it is grey, sometimes it is yellow. I have made a calendar based on the shade of grey. I think the yellow means it is summer, but maybe they just changed the bulb outside. The most haunting accounts were of internal companionship. My father visits me. He sits on the other bunk and we talk about the Dasha. He died in 1982. I know he is dead. But here he is more real than the man who shares my cell. We have long conversations. Sometimes I prefer his company. Another wrote of a full-blown phantom family that lived with him, children who played in the corner, a wife who cooked imaginary meals. They are kind to me. They do not ask me what I did to come here. These were not the calculated lies of manipulators. They were the desperate confessions of minds constructing a reality to replace the one that had been taken away. The system had eliminated all external stimuli, all meaningful markers of time and place. In response, the mind, that indefatigable generator of meaning, began to consume itself, projecting its own contents onto the blank screen of the cell. The perfect isolation had become a canvas for madness. The body, the thing the system was so adept at containing, began to rebel in ways that mocked the physical controls. Advanced somatic disorders appeared, with no clear physiological cause. Inmates developed psychogenic paralysis, waking up to find a leg or an arm utterly useless, dead weight attached to them. Medical examinations found no nerve damage, no stroke, no trauma. The limb was simply refused. Others were afflicted with chronic excruciating pain, back pain, headache, joint pain, that no analgesic could touch. It was pain as emotion, as condensed time, expressing itself through the only conduit left, the nervous system. Then came the self-harm. It was not the dramatic, suicidal wrist-slashing of storybooks. It was slower, more grotesque, a kind of negotiation with the flesh. Men would pick at their skin until it bled, then pick at the scabs, creating festering open wounds. They would swallow objects, spoons, bits of plastic, radio parts, in a perverse attempt to feel something internal, to force the system to react, to be taken to the medical wing where the light was different, the faces were new. One inmate, over the course of 2 years, slowly chewed off the tips of his own fingers. When asked why by a baffled doctor, he reportedly said, "I was hungry for something that wasn't food." The prison infirmary, a clean, white-tiled space with a few beds, was equipped for emergencies, stitching a wound, setting a bone, treating an infection. It was not equipped for chronic treatment-resistant psychosomatic illness. A man with paralysis would be scanned, tested, and when nothing physical was found, diagnosed with conversion disorder and sent back to his cell with a shrug. The system's response was to pathologize the inmate, not the environment. The problem was in the faulty component, not in the machine that was grinding it down. A grim numerical rule began to emerge from the data quietly collected by the few interested psychologists. By the mid-2000s, an estimated 60% of black dolphins' long-term population was on permanent, high-dose regimens of psychiatric medication. The vault was not just storing men, it was chemically sedating them into a manageable state of quiet despair. The silence was now pharmaceutical. The violence, when it came, was of a new kind. The system's physical protocols had made organized rebellion or coordinated attack a fantasy. The two-man rule, the bent walk, the sequential gaits, they were brilliant defenses against externalized threat, but they were useless against the internalized psychotic violence that now boiled over. The attacks were sudden, explosive, and profoundly irrational. A prisoner, during his 30 minutes in the exercise cage, would without warning or provocation launch himself at the wire mesh, clawing and biting at it until his fingers were bloody stumps and his teeth were cracked, screaming not at the guards, but at the sky, at voices only he could hear. A cellmate, after years of silent coexistence, would wake in the perpetual half-light and fly into a frenzy, attacking the other man with his bare hands, not in a fight for dominance, but with the blank, terrifying fury of a seizure. Guards intervening would find the attacker often did not resist. He would simply stop, slump, and look around with vacant confusion, as if waking from a dream. Hunger strikes became a common, if futile, language of protest. But these were not the politically calculated fasts of dissidents. They were acts of profound nihilism. Men would simply stop eating. No demands were issued. No statements were made. They would just lie on their slabs, turning their faces to the wall, refusing the trays that slid through the slots. The system had a protocol for this too: force feeding. A medical team would restrain the inmate, insert a nasal gastric tube, and pump a nutrient slurry directly into his stomach. It was a clinical dehumanizing procedure that treated the hunger strike as a medical problem, not a cry of existential anguish. The inmate would be kept alive, his body maintained, so that his mind could continue its sentence. The system could not allow the escape of death. That would be a form of victory it could not permit. The most chilling incidents were the attacks on guards. They were rare, but they struck at the heart of the system's confidence. They did not happen during transfers or in open areas. They happened in the cells, in that moment of proximity when a tray was being retrieved or a cuff was being checked. An inmate, for years a model of passive, broken compliance, would move with shocking speed, not to take a weapon, not to take a hostage, but to spit, to bite, to smear his own feces, to headbutt the guard's chest. It was a violence of pure contamination, an attempt to drag the clean, orderly world of the guard into the filthy, chaotic world of the cell. The response was swift and brutal. The inmate would be subdued, beaten, placed in a straitjacket, and thrown into a bare isolation cell for weeks. But the damage was done. The illusion of the inmate as a passive, managed object was shattered. The guards now knew that behind the bowed head and the shuffling gait, a storm could be gathering, invisible to the 242 cameras. The threat profile had fundamentally shifted. The danger was no longer the cunning, coordinated escape plot. It was the random, psychotic eruption of a consciousness that had been driven past its breaking point by the very perfection of its cage. The administration faced a dilemma it was not designed to solve. Publicly, in rare statements to state-aligned media, officials defended Black Dolphin as a necessary evil. "These are monsters," a deputy warden said in a 2008 interview. "Cannibals, terrorists who have killed children. Society has a right to be protected from them. Our duty is to ensure they never walk free, and we do that perfectly." He would then point to the concessions, the tiny gestures presented as evidence of humanity, the prison radio channel broadcasting patriotic music and news, the small library from which all works of fiction or philosophy were carefully purged, leaving only technical manuals and sanitized classics. The occasional showing of an approved film in a common room, though the inmates watched it from individual separated booths. Privately, in meetings in Moscow, the reports were more troubling. The cost of pharmaceuticals was rising. The attrition rate among guards was increasing, not from danger, but from a kind of moral and emotional fatigue. The product of the prison was no longer just contained men. It was a growing population of severely mentally ill men who required ever more complex and expensive management. The system's logic began to twist in on itself. To maintain the absolute control that prevented escape, they had to create conditions that destroyed minds. To manage the destroyed minds, they had to use chemical and physical restraints that further eroded any semblance of humanity, reinforcing the need for absolute control. It was a closed, vicious circle. The administration's fatal flaw was a philosophical one. They measured success by a single binary metric: escape or no escape. By that measure, Black Dolphin was a stellar success, perhaps the most successful prison in human history. They refused to accept that the psychological disintegration was not a side effect, but the primary product of their system. A prisoner who was a hallucinating, self-mutilating shell was, in their view, still successfully contained. The system had neutralized the societal threat. That it had also neutralized the human being was, to their logic, irrelevant. The man had been declared irredeemable. What did it matter if his mind was now a ruin? The vault was secure. The archive was intact. The fact that the pages were now blank was not a failure of the archive. It was the expected outcome for such dangerous material. And so, Black Dolphin inadvertently became the world's most rigorous and most horrific laboratory of long-term sensory deprivation. It was an experiment that no ethics committee would ever approve, but which ran continuously, with a large captive sample group and perfect environmental controls. The variable was time. The outcome was the systematic dismantling of the human psyche. The data was irrefutable. Remove all autonomy, all sensory variation, all social meaning, all temporal markers, and the mind does not enter a state of quiet peace. It turns feral. It attacks itself. It fabricates realities to fill the void. It expresses its agony through the body. The absolute isolation regime was a hypothesis that human danger can be permanently contained through environmental engineering. The hypothesis was proven correct in its narrowest sense, but the experiment also proved a far broader, more terrifying theorem, that such containment is not a neutral act. It is an active, destructive process. You cannot build a perfect cage for the animal without making a torture chamber for the ghost inside. The crisis was not an event, it was a state of being. The system had not broken down. It was functioning exactly as designed. The crack-up was happening inside the men, and it was total. The battle the system had been built to win, the battle against physical escape, was long over and victory was absolute. But a war it never knew it was fighting, the war for the integrity of the human consciousness trapped within its walls, was being lost, completely and catastrophically. The machine hummed on, spotless, silent, observing every external motion with its 242 unblinking eyes. And inside its perfect, immutable shell, in the private, unobservable hell of each man's skull, time had solidified into a crushing weight, thought had curdled into nightmare, and the soul had eroded into a fine grey dust. The living coffin was sealed, and within it, everything that made a human being was slowly, methodically dying. The wind still blows across the steppe, but it no longer moans only around the stones of Orenburg. It finds echoes in other geometries, in other landscapes of control. To understand the legacy of the Black Dolphin, one must look into a global mirror. The philosophy it embodies, the permanent, high-security neutralization of the irredeemable, is not a Russian invention. It is a modern penological reflex. In the Colorado high desert of the United States, the Administrative Maximum Facility in Florence, ADX, operates on a similar, though distinct, logic. There the tool of choice is prolonged, often indefinite solitary confinement. Inmates in the Range 13 unit spend 23 hours a day in a soundproofed cell, with an hour of solitary exercise in a concrete pit. The technology is different. The control is more automated. The cells are single occupancy. The aesthetic is a sterile beige efficiency. But the goal is congruent: to eliminate risk by eliminating contact, to manage the most dangerous by rendering them inert. In Cameroon, the Kondengui Central Prison's maximum security wing, known as Bamenda, achieves a similar end through brutal overcrowding and neglect, a chaotic cousin to the dolphin's sterile order. Yet, the Black Dolphin stands apart in the purity of its implementation. It is not merely a supermax, it is a total system. ADX Florence allows for some programming, some legal contact, a view of the mountains, though through a narrow slit of opaque glass. The Dolphin permits none of that. It combines the architectural totality of a Cold War bunker with the ritualized physical humiliation of the Pochodka and applies it for life without the possibility of parole or meaningful review. It represents not just an extreme point on the spectrum of punishment, but the logical endpoint of a security paradigm that has decisively won the argument in many parts of the world. The paradigm asks a simple question: what do we do with those we have decided cannot be fixed, and from whom we must be permanently protected? The Dolphin provides the purest answer. You build a vault. You design not for change, but for stasis. You invest not in the mind, but in the walls that contain it. The global shift is visible. From rehabilitation to risk management, from the ideal of correction to the reality of warehousing, Black Dolphin is not an anomaly. It is the most honest expression of a widespread, unspoken conclusion that for some, humanity is a forfeit concept, and the only remaining duty of the state is to archive the dangerous remainder. It is a museum of that conclusion, its exhibits still breathing. And so the monument endures. In the present day, the town of Soliletsk and the wider Orenburg region have an uneasy symbiosis with the institution. It is a major employer. Its walls are a fixed fact of the landscape, as natural as a hill. The system has not remained frozen. It has evolved within its own immutable principles. The 242 cameras have been upgraded to digital models, their feeds sharper, stored on vast servers. The control room monitors are now flat panel displays. The metal doors have newer, more secure locking mechanisms, but the principles are untouched. The Pochodka remains. The sequential gates still hiss and clang. The windows are still sealed and frosted. The prison has adapted to new national threats. Alongside the aging serial killers and cannibals from the Soviet era, now sit convicted terrorists from the Chechen wars, radical Islamists convicted of bombings and hostage-takings, high-profile assassins and organized crime leaders. The system is indifferent to ideology. It processes them all with the same sterile protocol. The foundational pillar of its legitimacy remains unshaken, a number repeated like a mantra in every official description. Zero escapes. The machine continues its silent, perfect work. It does not ask why. It simply is. But an audit of its legacy must move beyond the balance sheet of security. There is a human cost, a debt accrued in a currency of shattered minds and fractured spirits, and it extends beyond the men in the cells. The relatives of inmates exist in a parallel silent hell. Wives, mothers, siblings, they are tied to a ghost. Visits are so rare, so heavily monitored and brief, as to be a form of torture in themselves. Correspondence is censored into meaningless platitudes. Over the decades, the letters from inside change. The handwriting deteriorates. The sentences become disjointed, circling, filled with strange obsessions or blank despair. Then sometimes they stop altogether. The relative is left with a terrible ambiguity. Is he dead? Is he catatonic? Has he simply forgotten who I am? There is no closure, only a slow, drawn-out severance. The family member lives with a man who is biologically alive, but socially and psychologically annihilated, a living absence. They serve a life sentence of worry and grief, their loved one preserved in a state of living death by the state. The guards, too, bear a cost, though it is one the system is designed to mask. The young recruits are trained to see inmates as objects, as bodies or units. This dissociation is a professional necessity, but over years, the act takes its toll. To repeatedly force a human being into a bent-over shuffle, to listen to the muffled sobs from a cell, to clean up after a suicide or subdue a man lost in a psychotic rage, and to do so without acknowledging the shared humanity of the person before you, this requires a sustained act of psychic violence against oneself. Many develop what psychologists call institutional dissociation. They speak of inmates in the subhuman terms the system encourages: animals, monsters, waste. This is not just bigotry, it is a coping mechanism, a wall they build to protect their own sanity from the reality of what they are participating in. The moral injury is slow and cumulative, Retired guards often speak in flat, emotionless tones about their work, their eyes avoiding contact. Some descend into alcoholism. Their memories a locked box they try to drown. They were the operators of a perfect machine, but to operate it, they had to sacrifice a piece of their own souls. The system externalizes its true cost onto them, turning them into its first and most complicit casualties. The final verdict on the Black Dolphin is not one of engineering, but of philosophy. Ethicists and neuroscientists who study it see it as a test case for a flawed theorem. The theorem states, if you completely control the environment, stimulus, social contact, temporal markers, physical autonomy, you can neutralize the dangerous human element within it. The Black Dolphin proves the first half of the theorem with brutal efficiency. But it also reveals the catastrophic error in the second half. The human mind is not a static element, it is a process, a dynamic system requiring input, narrative, and a sense of agency to maintain coherence. When you strip all that away, you do not achieve neutralization. You trigger a chaotic, degenerative process. The mind, in its desperate search for meaning, turns on itself. It fabricates horrors to fill the void. It expresses its agony through the body. The prison becomes a factory for psychosis. The theorem is flawed because it views consciousness as a thing to be contained, when it is in fact a fire that, when deprived of all external fuel, begins to consume its own vessel. The philosophical takeaway is crystallized in the silence of the cells. The Black Dolphin represents the ultimate triumph of the materialist security paradigm and its ultimate failure. You can, with enough concrete, steel, and political will, build a perfect cage for the animal. The body can be contained, preserved, kept from harming others. This is a real and, from a societal safety perspective, a valid achievement. But in building that perfect physical cage, you inevitably construct a far more terrifying prison for the ghost inside, the consciousness, the spirit, the self. That inner entity cannot be quarantined. It cannot be archived. Subjected to absolute control and sensory starvation, it does not become quiet. It becomes a screaming chaos. The most profound confinement the dolphin achieves is not of the body to a cell, but of a mind to a hell of its own making, a hell crafted by the absolute emptiness of the world around it. The prison wins the battle it was designed to fight and loses a war it never understood it was waging. This leads to the final unasked question that hangs over the steppe, over Moscow, over any society that maintains such an institution. What is the purpose of a punishment that goes beyond secure containment into the realm of psychological annihilation? The system itself offers no answer. It is a tool, a blind process. The question of purpose belongs entirely to the society that wields it. Does society seek retribution? The dolphin provides it in a form more absolute than any execution, a slow, living death of the mind. Does it seek deterrence? The legend of the dolphin serves that purpose, a dark fairy tale for the criminal world. Does it seek safety? It delivers that, unquestionably. But at what point does the pursuit of safety become a ritual of sacrifice, where we offer up the minds of the condemned, not to any god of justice, but to the idol of absolute control? The continued existence of the Black Dolphin is not a necessity born of overwhelming practical need. It is a choice. It is a societal choice to deal with certain human beings, not as failed members of the community, but as objects, toxic, radioactive objects, to be stored in a state of perpetual, living decay. The prison is a successful implementation of that choice. Its legacy is the proof that the choice can be made and carried through with flawless technical precision. The final shift in perspective is this: Black Dolphin is not a malfunction, it is a mirror. It shows us the cold, logical endpoint of a belief that some people are beyond the pale of human concern, and that the ultimate expression of justice is to bury them alive in a tomb of their own consciousness. And so, we return to the living museum. At dusk, the walls of the complex are the color of dried blood against the darkening steppe. Inside, the eternal electric day persists. In the central control room, the glow of the 242 monitors casts a pale blue light on the faces of the guards. Their eyes flick from screen to screen, watching the silent tableau, a man staring at a wall, another pacing the three-step width of his cell, two figures sitting motionless on their stools, lost in separate, incommunicable voids. The logs are updated. A button is pressed. Somewhere in the labyrinth a hydraulic piston engages. A heavy gate sighs open, then seals shut with a final, resonant clunk that echoes down empty corridors. In a cell, inmate number, say, 877, feels the vibration of that distant gate through the concrete slab he sits on. He no longer wonders what it signifies. He has lost the ability to connect cause and effect. The sound is just a punctuation mark in the endless, run-on sentence of his existence. He looks at the frosted window, where the grey light is deepening to a murky black. Or is it? It's hard to tell. The cell light never changes. He has a memory, fragile as a moth's wing, of a sunset. He tries to hold on to it, but it dissolves into the static of the present. His cellmate murmurs in his sleep, a name that is not his own. The camera in the ceiling watches, its red LED a tiny, unblinking star in his artificial sky. He has been here for 18 years, or is it 25? Time is not a river. It is sediment. It has settled in his joints, in his thoughts, a heavy, inert mass. He is not serving a sentence anymore. He is a specimen in a jar, and the preservative is silence. The system endures not because it must, but because it can. It is a monument to its own possibility. It stands as a warning, but a warning that only resonates for those who look beyond the proud statistic of 0 escapes to the human wreckage within. That wreckage is its true exhibit, the bent-over men, the chemically subdued minds, the whispers of phantom families, the bodies attacking themselves. These are not failures. They are the successful products of the system's design. They are the proof of the theorem and the evidence of its fatal flaw. The ultimate legacy of the Black Dolphin is not a story of escape, but a story of erosion. It is a testament to the irreducible, corrosive nature of consciousness itself when trapped in an immutable shell. The fortress built by Catherine to keep nomads out became over centuries a perfect lockbox for human beings. In doing so, it revealed a darker truth. The most impregnable prison is not made of stone and steel, but of time and thought, refined to a terrible purity. The cameras watch. The inmates walk, bent double, their world a patch of floor. Time settles, thick and heavy, in the sealed spaces between one meaningless day and the next. The living coffin remains, a perfect, silent solution to a problem of its own redefining. It sought to cage the beast, and succeeded. But in its success, it discovered that the beast was only ever the keeper, and the thing it kept, the human spirit, was far more fragile, and in its destruction far more terrible. The wind on the steppe moans, a sound older than empires, carrying nothing, changing nothing. Inside the walls, the experiment continues. The data accumulates. The silence deepens.